So we've looked at Hamill's work in the 70s, right, which is the stuff that's universally agreed to be classic. We've looked at the 80s, where he was challenging himself to write simpler, more straightforward songs, and where synthesized textures came into the picture a lot more. If you haven't seen those videos and my intro video to this project, I would recommend that you go check them out, because they'll give you some context for what I'm doing here. Before I start ranking and reviewing the 90s albums, I do want to swear up and down that I am a Peter Hammill fan, right? I like some things more than others, but everything he's done seems like it comes from his particular corner of the universe. It's all worth checking out. And like I've said a couple times, I think that understanding the scale and ambition of the whole catalog makes it more interesting to approach any one particular work. I say all that because, if you watch this video, you'll see that I do consider this to be his weakest decade, right? And I'm going to be fairly critical of a lot of the albums that he released during this time. I don't want to say he lost his way here, because there's a core set of principles that he certainly never gave up. But a lot of this stuff, it lacks intensity, right? And worse than that, it's not really aware that it lacks intensity. It tends to think that it is fiercer and louder and weirder than maybe it really is. And I do think maybe that's symptomatic of a lot of musicians of his generation as they entered the 90s. They had come of age being on the cutting edge. In a lot of cases, they got, poppier and synthier during the 80s. And then suddenly, they're operating in a period where lyrically and sonically, mainstream music was heavier and more abrasive than it had ever been. So a lot of the time they respond to that by either trying to make things that rock out and fail, or by kind of retreating into easy listening. And for as much as Hamill's always done his own thing, I do think that you can see him falling into that syndrome in the 90s where actually both of those things happened to him over the course of the decade. So, for somebody who is a couple generations older than me, right, who maybe was following Hammill consistently since the 70s, who maybe wasn't that into a lot of what was happening in popular music in the early 90s, a lot of this stuff might have landed differently, right? But, I was born in 1984. I was listening to grunge and industrial in the early 90s when it was in its time. I was a really big fan of those things as, a child and an adolescent. They were very formative to my taste. I acquired in most of Hammill's catalog in 2014, particularly the 90s stuff. So, looking at it from that vantage point, it seemed really clear to me that he had done more powerful stuff both before and after. So before we go any further, I'm Hans Berger from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a music project that combines aspects of progressive rock, ambient, post-punk. Check us out on Spotify, Bandcamp, wherever you get your music. It doesn't actually make it better when I improvise. Oh, God.
Filling the place with a stench of alcohol and piss!
Now, the story of this is actually pretty interesting, right? Hammill and Roger Eno both agreed that they would improvise in separate locations, but at a particular scheduled time, right? So at a particular time of a particular day, they would both be improvising in totally different locations. And then they layered those two recordings on top of each other, right? So that's an intriguing technique in the abstract, right? It's a good idea. But the end result sounds like improvised synth music made by two people who were not listening to each other. I don't think it's drastically less cohesive and orderly than improvised synth music made by two people who were listening to each other. But I can't think of much to say about it beyond that. To me, this fits pretty squarely into the fans-only category.
Filling the place with a stench of alcohol and piss!
So at the beginning of the 90s, Hammill had the idea that he was going to be alternating albums, right? That he was going to be trading off between heavy and light, with Fireships, the album before this, being a light album in that sequence, and this being a heavy one. And he didn't stick with that, thank God, because frankly, he doesn't do heavy well, right? And when I say heavy, meaning the kind of classic loud guitar, Sturm und Drang kind of arrangement. And you can hear him really trying on this album. Most of the arrangements are built around big distorted guitars. There's one song where the lyrics are just all about how much he loves noise. The cover is a speaker. It's all a really clear mission statement. And the whole thing, it hits like a wet noodle. It's unfortunate and a little surprising because, the Van der Graaf stuff was about as intense and heavy and unsettling as anything else that was happening in its time, but it's been a couple decades and things have changed. This is the year that Nirvana released In Utero, right, which is their even noisier, heavier, louder follow-up to Nevermind. This comes out a few months after Nine Inch Nails released Broken, right? A very heavy guitar-based album that is also, very successful in the mainstream. So this is right in the middle of a period when enormously successful mainstream music is as sonically intense as it's ever going to be. And I don't know if he was actually listening that much to Nine Inch Nails or Nirvana or whatever else. I'm sure he knew they existed, but I don't know if he had any real exposure or interest, And I don't know how much the attempt at heaviness here is trying to tap into that zeitgeist, but there's a generational issue where he just, frankly, can't do it. And I think it's the closest that he's ever come, deliberately or not, to embarrassing himself by trying to keep up with the times. So what you have here is this very ineffective sound being applied to what's also mostly not very good songs. There's an awful lot of archness here. There are lots of attempts to mock celebrity culture and materialism. Something that kind of tries to be a verbal equivalent to the harshness of the Sonix. And that's also in keeping with the times, but it's really no more effective, right? And, there's not much in the way of interesting riffs or vocal melody. Now, the last couple of songs here almost stick the landing. Planet Coventry has some solid hooks. It has an unembarrassing lyric. And Primo on the Parapet is actually one of his best songs of all time. It's an epic tribute to the Holocaust survivor Primo Levi. It's in a different world from the rest of the album in terms of the quality and the kind of emotional and intellectual heft of it. And it's really the only thing here that he's played much consistently since then.
Filling the place with a stench of alcohol and piss.
So Hamill did a few band albums in the early 90s, right? He did The Noise, which I just talked about. He did Roaring Forties, which I'll get to later. He did a live album called Here Comes the Daylight that frankly isn't very good. And after that, when he stopped working with that set of people, he moved into a pretty consistent kind of singer-songwriter format where he was working alone, mostly doing relatively short conventional songs. The arrangements tended to involve some relatively simple guitar, maybe some basic drums, maybe some very ambient synth, and oftentimes a lot of vocal overdubbing. Now, Wikipedia refers to this style as chamber music, which actually doesn't seem like a bad description to me. And so the mood and the quality of individual songs, it might vary quite a lot from here, but that basic approach is actually going to be really consistent for quite a long run of albums, right? And that whole approach starts here. Honestly, it's not an amazing start. So the first song So the first song on here is very interesting from an arrangement perspective, right? It's totally a cappella, and it signals something that's going to become more of a feature of albums in this period, which is really creative, rich layers of vocal overdubbing. I'll talk much more about that as we go through the 90s and the 2000s. And the song itself is maybe a bit major key for my taste, but it has a very memorable melody. It expresses a clear idea with some emotional intricacy to it. I can't deny it's a solid piece of writing. After that, though, this is one of those albums that I know some people really like. A few of these songs have become fixtures in performance, so maybe I'll get some heat for criticizing it, but I don't think that the rest of it is actually very inspired. The fake heaviness from The Noise is gone, but there's not really anything much to replace it particularly, right? There's no distinct or surprising sonic angle. There aren't really riffs or instrumental hooks. The vocal melodies aren't always that memorable after the first song. The lyrics, a lot of the time, are kind of reaching for drama and profundity that they don't quite achieve. There's a song about materialism that's literally just called Material Possession. There's a song about narcissism that's called The Narcissus Bar and Grill. So, not a lot of points for subtlety there. Amnesiac and Earthbound have nice melodies, but the lyrics don't really say much of anything. There's a section at the end of Earthbound where he sings anagrams of the title. That's conceptually clever, but it's basically unmoving. So ultimately, there are a lot of ideas here that don't really stick, and the few ideas that do stick are attached to other things that don't. Overall, it's a landmark in that it sets the template for a lot of further work, but I don't think that the execution of that template is all that successful here. So this is the next in the string of singer-songwriter chamber music albums that I'd mentioned. It's the follow-up to X My Heart. It's very, very sedate, right? It's probably the most hushed and relaxed that he's been since And Close as This. Now, that's not to say that it is a stripped-down album, because in fact it has a kind of mistiness to it. All the songs kind of seem like they come out of a warm pea soup fog. One of the songs is called Phosphorescence, and it has the line, "Ships pass in the night, and in their wake they leave just phosphorescence." And the whole album feels sonically like that line, right? It's very well suited for a long drive at night, which is an appealing quality. All that being said, there are a few places where memorable songs do rise out of that haze. There are a lot of places where they don't. This is an improvement on X My Heart. You can see him refining the formula of that album. But ultimately, there are a lot of other things that he did in this basic format and style that have more memorable material, right? There's nothing much here to inspire negative feeling. There's also not a lot, really, that sinks in.
Filling the place with a stench of alcohol and piss!
This is an opera written by Hammill and Chris Judge Smith. So when I say this is an opera, the singing style is maybe closer to what you would think of as show tunes, actually. Now, there are two versions. There's one from 1981, which uses synthesizers to try to emulate something orchestral, not always very successfully, honestly. Whereas the 1989 version uses more guitar-based arrangements, ultimately is maybe more the one I'd recommend. So this is a project that he worked on for years. I do hate to dismiss it, but it's less of a Peter Hammill album than maybe just a very gothic piece of musical theater that Hammill happened to be involved in. It's competent enough that it doesn't seem cheesy or silly. There's some very cool work with overdubs, vocal overdubs that represent the spirit of the house. It does tell the story in a quite vivid manner. It's involved enough that I hate to write it off as for fans only, but it's not really of a piece with his other work. It's not something that I've come back to that much since I've owned it as a listener.
Filling the place with a stench of alcohol and piss!
So the liner notes call this a sequel to Loops and Reels, which you may remember was one of my favorite albums of his from the 80s, and I think is just generally among his best work. But Loops and Reels was actually surprisingly song-based, which I think is part of the strength of it, right? Whereas this is more a collection of soundtracks. Most of the pieces come from a film score that he did, which has lots of tense string arrangements and electric guitar on top of it. It's a notch above a lot of other soundtrack albums, maybe from other artists, but ultimately it can't quite escape those roots. However, this album also includes a MIDI piano piece called Labyrinthine Dreams that he wrote for a ballet. And that piece actually has some very nice melodies, some nice themes that are developed in some very interesting ways. It even has some vocal sections with lyrics, so it really feels like a developed piece of long-form writing. It's the only thing here that maybe lives up to the legacy of loops and reels. It might be more effective if it were played on live piano. The MIDI piano is quite rigid, but there are reasons for using the MIDI relative to the staging of it, and it does give it a particular character. This isn't a classic necessarily, but it's a more interesting part of his catalog than you might expect.
Filling the place with a stench of alcohol and piss!
This is the last album he made with a full band before the Vandergraaf reunion. It's also the last album until then that is really solidly in a prog rock idiom, right? There are only 5 songs. One of those is a 20-minute multi-part suite. 2 of those are just a little under 10 minutes. And we've got David Jackson on this album. We've got the violinist Stuart Gordon, who was a secret weapon for live performance during this time. So, I want to like this. I want to love it, in fact. And it's certainly designed to hit a particular kind of prog fan pleasure center. And of course, I'm rating it a lot higher than a lot of other things he did in the 90s, but I do still feel like there are a lot of missed opportunities here. Now, this may be an unpopular opinion, but I think one thing that really holds this album back, and a lot of other things during this period, is the drumming. He was working with someone named Manny Elias, who was the original drummer in Tears for Fears, who's worked with Peter Gabriel and Julian Lennon and Nazareth and fucking Dolly Parton, right? So he has an amazing CV. But his style on this and the noise and Here Comes the Daylight, I think, is a major limiting factor to the overall success of the music. He plays these very simple, repetitive drum lines, and while his playing does have a nice, thick tone to it, it has a nice kind of driving quality. On the other hand, it doesn't really have any dynamic, it doesn't have any subtlety. The result tends to be to really simplify arrangements of pieces that I think really would benefit from something more elaborate. If you want a good sense of what I mean, try listening to the version of the song Sign from the album The Margin with Guy Evans playing, and then listen to that back to back with the version on Here Comes the Daylight with Manny Elias. Now I get why Hamill might want someone who's very different from Guy Evans, right? And maybe there are people who are big fans of Manny Elias and can point out qualities in his work that I am missing. But, on this album, you have 8 9-minute songs that might only have one compositional idea. And in a piece like that, you're really missing an opportunity if the drummer spends that whole song playing one basic track with very little dynamic variation. So like the first song here, Sharply Unclear, has a great melody, it has an interesting lyric. It seems like Hamill's getting quite venomously upset about video editing techniques, which is weird enough that I can get behind it. But ultimately, the arrangement is just the loud part from She's So Heavy, right? And it's a really good piece of writing, but it's played in this very pedestrian way. And then The Gift of Fire, the bridge has this very compelling melody. It goes through a neat progression, but then the culminating line is She Had the Gift of Talk Turkey, which is repeated a number of times throughout the song. And I think that lyric just kind of turns the drama into bathos. And all that's happening on top of that is very simple. Then there's You Can't Want What You Always Get, right? Like the whole lyric is pretty much just contained in that title. There's not much melody to speak of. Again, the song is quite long and repetitive and just doesn't seem like it knows how to make use of the time that it's taking. Now look, if you've got Hamill ranting and you've got David Jackson making sax noises, you've got various kinds of synth sounds, Stuart Gordon doing his violin things, then that's great. And there's a certain floor of enjoyment that can't really sink below, right? That's a lot of good ingredients. But frankly, this stuff is pretty close to that floor. What does save the album is the 20-minute suite, a headlong stretch, which really has the kind of complexity and intelligence and honestly dignity that you would expect from an album like this, right? It has some wonderful dreamy passages. It has a section where you have a very quiet theme, like wrestling for space with a loud theme in a very interesting way. It has a developed and moving lyric with a clear theme. And it has some Vandergraafian bits of near cacophony, right? So it really has the quiet and the storm. And it has all the musical detail that you would want in a piece like that. When I was talking in my 80s video about the song Now Lover, I said then that it sounded like it had been beamed in from some alternate universe where Vandergraaf never broke up, right? And this is almost that same thing. If you had Guy Evans here, or some other drummer who could achieve something like that same amount of dynamic and subtlety, then this would essentially be 90s Vandergraaf. But that aside, even without him, it's still a really fantastic piece. If the whole album were of that quality, it might be one of the all-timers, right? As it is, it's highly uneven, but still a key work.
Filling the place with a stench of alcohol and piss.
Not the most promising title, right? But this album is fucking great. This is the third in the series of kind of smaller scale chamber music albums after X My Heart and Everyone You Hold. And there are bits here and there of Jackson and Gordon and Elias, but ultimately this is not a band album. What it is, I think, is really proof of concept for this type of album. This is the point where it becomes clear that he can make this format work in a way that will eventually produce some of the best stuff of his whole career. Now, there's a change here from the last couple of releases into a mood of much deeper tension and mystery and darkness, maybe in ways that almost verge on self-parody, frankly, right? This is an album that has a song called Nightman, followed by a song called City of Night. But that moodiness really foreshadows the work he'd be doing in the next decade, and I, for one, am wholly behind it, right? Because the quality of the melody writing in particular is as great as he would ever do. The arrangements are simple, but they carry the songs across. The lyrics are maybe more interesting in some places than others, but again, they're bearing the moods of the song well. Not a perfect album, but it's a big advancement on what he had done in this vein up until now. Of particular interest here is the final song, The Light Continent, which is basically like a 15-minute ambient synth song about Antarctica, sort of Hamill's version of an Immortal album, but without the black metal. And it really does sound like a continent made of light. It's one of those fantastic things that Hamill will find sometimes where there's a real unity between lyrical concept and musical content. Just like Skin, just like Roaring Forties, what you have here is an extended piece at the end of the album that really carries something over the border from kind of a pretty good album in the scheme of his catalog into the realm of something that's definitely an important work.
You're my favorite.
All right, now we are fucking talking. One thing I've noticed as I've been doing these reviews is the harsher reviews, the more critical reviews, tend to be longer, right? Because I generally love Peter Hammill. And maybe that's not so clear from how I've been reacting to his 90s work, but I do. I enjoy listening to that work and thinking about it, even when I don't feel like it's at its best necessarily. But when I don't like something, I feel an obligation to really make a case for why I don't like it. Whereas when I do like something, I'm more comfortable just saying, no, this is great. Now, Fireships is great. And this album is a lot of why I've purchased and listened to, 50-some Peter Hammill albums, counting the live albums. This is a lot of why I've kept coming back to them, trying to crack them open, even when they didn't register at first. I've also noticed that Hammill tends to do dark better than light, and in the post-Vandergraaf years, he tends to do quiet a lot better than he does loud. But what he's done here is create a very dark, very soft album. a set of songs that is consistently running at the level of a hushed whisper. But in that hush, in that whisper, there is a sustained level of quality and intensity that he doesn't often hit. Every song here has a memorable melody. Every song here has a lyric which has a narrative quality plus an underlying philosophical idea. So for all its dynamic quietude, this is a very emotionally rich, intellectually sophisticated album. Now, one thing I will say is that it's built on, the synth and drum sounds that are very rooted in that kind of late 80s, early 90s cusp, right? Where they can sound a little fake, a little slick, a little dated to modern ears. Every time I come back to this album, it does take me a minute to adjust to that. But I don't think it takes away from the basic success of what he's done here. So that's my rundown of the 90s work. I hope I haven't been too unkind to it. Feel free to jump into the comments if you think that I have been. In the meantime, of course, it's very helpful if you can like, subscribe, check out Electric Brain, Electric Shadow on Spotify, Bandcamp, wherever else you get your music. I'll see everybody for the 2000s.